Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you're joining us today. I'm very excited about this next guest. I've actually been looking forward to speaking with her and hearing her profound wisdom and the journey that she's taken, especially in this particular area. Everyone, please welcome Jill Peirce. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you.
And I want to share your bio for a moment before we get into this conversation that I know is going to be just really inspirational and life-changing for many of us, I think. Jill Peirce is a British voice teacher, family constellations therapist, and author. She pioneered both the sound healing and ancestral healing and family constellation movements through her rediscovery of ancient vocal techniques and use of the voice as a magical instrument for healing and meditation. Thank you for your work. Thank you for pioneering all of this, Jill. How did you first come to this work? Was it an ancestral pattern? Was it an ancestral story? Was it something that called you deeply from your own lineage that brought you to this work, the work that you're sharing with us in the world now?
Well, I don't think it really was. I started many years ago. I mean, almost 40 years ago, working with sound. I pioneered the whole teaching of sound as a meditative practice, and in particular, teaching harmonic chant, overtone chanting, where you chant on a single note and you amplify the internal structure of the sound, which is a harmonic, so you hear them floating above the note, like the music of the spheres. It's been said. And so I started working with sound, and then I started working in pretty wild shamanic ways with people. And then I started doing ceremonies to honor the ancestors. I would go up through the female lines and the male lines with people. And then I found doing that had the most extraordinary effect. I mean, people would say that their family members had telephoned them in the middle and said, "What are you doing? Things have changed," and miraculous things started happening. So then that led me to work very much more specifically with sounds, with ancestors and with family constellations. So working with particular, untangling particular family patterns. And the family and ancestors is really it's a field phenomenon, and I've always been very interested in field phenomena. And and what happens is if there's any kind of interruption in an earlier generation, early deaths, suicides, emigrations, abortions, addictions, adoptions, accidents, incarcerations, injustices, anything societally inappropriate, anything transgressive or considered so at the time, nothing is now. And accidents, I mentioned that, and incarcerations, any abuse, of course, anything that early deaths, suicides, anything which interrupts the notional normal, ideally normal, if there is such a thing, idea of a family, then that leaves unfinished business. And the trauma of the event is trapped in the field. And then somehow acts as a sort of transgenerational compulsive magnet. And it draws subsequent generations, and the current generation in particular, always intersecting with the present moment, to be entangled with an earlier generational trauma. And so we find ourselves then somehow working, with the curse and the blessing become the same thing. So it's the fact that there is this trauma going down through the generations means that we have the opportunity of healing it. And the thing about ancestors is they have no agency unless we, the living, acknowledge them. And we know that societally because, in the armistice ceremonies, which, the societal norms in this country, certainly, the war dead, societally, we say, we will remember them. So we know. So the word remember, like the word collect, means to gather up the dispersed the dismembered bits. So we know that the dead need to be remembered. And sometimes when I work with people, you have to tell somebody who's no longer living that they are now an ancestor. And ancestors, once remembered, have a job to do, which is to keep the living alive. But they only do that once you activate until you activate their awareness of them, they're like clamorous children trying to get our attention, and in so doing they can trip us up and be thoroughly inconvenient. But once you activate these streams of transmission and you honor them, then they become guides and helpers and help the living remain alive. So this work is very much about bringing order into the system.
I love it. It's like they exist in the subconscious area of our psyche, of our being, but yet they're working through us in some way by us repeating our patterns or having obsessions or traumas, as you said. But once we look into this part of ourselves and bring it into the conscious sphere, it could actually work for us. So
I mean, I don't know whether this, we don't know in what way they work, whether it's unconscious, conscious. I mean, these are all words. We have absolutely no idea how it works. And we don't know where they are. It's all, anything we say about them is just sort of names, because we haven't the faintest idea what's going on. But what I do know is that this way of working is extraordinary. And the work with family constellation, whenever I'm working with people, I always do ceremonies for the ancestors first, because I like to get the ancestors on board, and because they have a job to keep the living alive. And so, if you do honor them, then they are active and present in whatever way that means. We don't know what that means, and the work with family constellations works with this unfinished business. And so, I have people choose representatives for their family members, for example, and say, I work ceremonially also, I should just say this, because I feel that it's very important to have a witness. And the reason for that is that when we go somewhere or come somewhere in order to do something, we're doing it to make changes in us. And those changes are new. And it's very, very difficult to uphold the new, because we have the whole history of being the way that we were before. And so what happens when we go somewhere and do something and change something is that we then go back into our societal context, and they don't know we've done anything. And so they act as a kind of, mirror of how we were before. And so we have no freedom to be anything else than we were before. Whereas if you have a witness, if you have people witnessing, which is what you do when you work with ceremonially, then those people know they're there when you make the change. And so you know that they know that you know that they know that there is no going back. And
yes.
This upholds you in the new. This is what we do with weddings, for example. We have witnesses who sign a document saying, I was there, I saw them going from being unmarried to being married. And this is why going off to, a remote place and being married underwater with very few relatives and very few witnesses isn't a very good idea.
Yeah, well, it's also the notion, I think, of accountability, right? As you're talking about being witnessed into this new change. For folks who are watching and enthralled with what you're saying, how can folks become more aware of family and ancestral patterns, right, that affect us? How can we become more aware?
It's very difficult without having somebody work with you. I mean, you need somebody to spot the connections, and that's what that's my job. That's why I work with people, because it's when I can see the connections between events through time and space. And that's one of the wonderful things about working in this way, is that you see the family through time and space. So normally, this is why it's so difficult, is because most people have a tiny little window of awareness, whether they were loved enough or not, whether they were loved more or less than their siblings. And that's really about it. So this work in order to do this work, I have to be absolutely present with the people and the representatives of the people who become the people in some very mysterious way, and to see, to intersect with the revelations of the present and guide it along a kind of the fault line of what's being revealed. And this is very difficult for somebody to do on their own. This is because of this narrow window that we have of whether we were loved or not. We don't really, we can't see the whole pattern. And this work is about revealing the pattern through space and through time and through the eyes of multiple members of the family. And of course, you can't do that on your own. So, I mean, the best thing people can do is find out, maybe talk to any living relatives and find out what the kind of interruptions were, early death, suicides, how people died, what they did, any traumas they had, of the kind that I was listing, adoptions, abortions, emigrations, accidents, incarcerations, all those kind of interruptions. It's quite helpful if you find them out from any living relatives you can, but then what you do with them, it's very difficult really to know what to do. But one of the things that people can do, and this is something that I've done, is to build an ancestral altar, or to make an ancestral altar. And this is a wonderful thing to have somewhere in your house. And it can be anything. It can be very simple. I did mine out of an old printing drawer where I put all sorts of little things representing both sides of my family, including, my children's teeth and my cat's whiskers and all kinds of other little things. And have that, with a candle and water and maybe some alcohol, they like alcohol, and activate it every day. I mean, if you go to the Far East, I mean, when I was in Japan in the early 80s, every family had an ancestral altar. And a ceremony was done every day. So fresh rice would be made. It would be the altar to the last male head of the family, because it's a very patriarchal society. So mine is not. Mine is to both sides of my family. But what they did then, and not so much now, because now when I talk to Japanese people, they say, oh yeah, my grandmother had one, or they have a little portable one, which. So, but traditionally, every day fresh rice would be made, alcohol or whatever the particular person liked would be put on the altar and prayers said. And interestingly, in the tsunami in 2011, there was some very strange stories. There were the whole the tsunami took away a whole school of young children, and so there were a lot of Zen and Shinto priests who found that there were people wandering around who were manifesting as ancestors who had been orphaned, in a sense. The children and the people that they looked after had been killed, and so they were sort of without a job, and so this is a whole side of the tsunami which is less known. So in the Far East, and of course in China, it's a big thing, having an ancestral altar and doing ancestral ceremonies and grave sweeping days, which I think is the 6th of April. So this is something that we've forgotten about in the West. And I think this is something that people can do, is to activate. It's not something that you can do once and then it's done. It's a bit like housework, you have to keep it going and keep honoring the ancestors. And it makes a huge change in people's lives.
I love that. Thank you so much for that practical advice. I'm South American, and I grew up with an ancestor altar that was tended to weekly, not daily, but weekly. So I love that you're sharing that with folks. I can see how difficult it could be for us to see the patterns for ourselves and needing to work with someone such as yourself so we can get the whole picture. How can people liberate themselves from inherited trauma? We know we can set up the altar, we can build this daily relationship. What do you think are some other steps that people can do?
Come and work with me. I mean, I'm working online at the moment, and this is amazing because it means that people who've been wanting to work with me from all over the world can come, and I'm doing it sort of every other month. And I mean, I say that because, as I say, it's really important to have somebody to guide you, and to see the things that you can't see yourself so often. So that's that really is the best thing I mean, apart from making an ancestral altar, finding out the facts and separation and interruption of the kind I was describing. is to come and work with me.
Love that.
And,
Yes.
and and you can get my information on my website, which is healingvoice.com, and I always put on the home page my next online workshops.
I love that. Yes, everyone, we'll come work with you. And when we induce order in the ancestral field, and I love what you talked about the ancestral field, right? Um, when we induce order, what are some of the benefits? Like, what are some of the benefits of connecting, right? You said they're like these children trying to get our attention. What are some of the benefits of inducing order and seeing the patterns and being able to be in ceremony or to do family constellation? What are some of the things that people will come away with, or how they'll be changed or shifted?
This induction of order is essential. So very often, for example, if somebody has abused you, or done some terrible injustice, on you, or taken all the family money, or whatever it happens to be, or abused you sexually, so the temptation is to cast that person to outer darkness and to cut all ties with them. And so the most important need, human need, is to belong. And so this person who's done you some kind of injustice is usually a powerful person. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done this kind of injustice. And so if you cast them out into outer, they're outside the field, and all they can do is make trouble for you. And in addition, you punish yourself, you blame yourself, and then nobody feels good because of what you've done. And so the only way to overcome this relationship with this person who has done you down in some way is to honor them. So one of the things that is very important is this notion of forgiveness. But it's very difficult to work with forgiveness in this work, because if I say, I forgive you, there's a very unconscious way that I'm elevating myself above you. And you poor little worm down there, I'm very grand and I'm very important. And I'm able to forgive you. So there's that very unconscious process which happens when you try and forgive somebody. But if you honor them, there's somebody who's abused you. So it's very counterintuitive. It's difficult. But, if you do, you're putting them above yourself. And you're putting yourself below them, and you're honoring them. And what you're doing then is allowing them to come back into the field. So the whole work is about collecting the outliers, remembering the forgotten. So if somebody has done you down, somebody has done some injustice, then the temptation is always to exclude them. And the whole nature of this work is against exclusion. It's about inclusion. And so the inclusion of these people, especially these powerful people, is the effect of this is that they find their rightful place within the field, and then order is inducted into the field, and everybody feels good. And the field includes everybody. So one of the things that, as I mentioned, you asked me how I began, and was seeing the effect of this work on the other members of the family. So it's really, really important that everybody's included. And this is the induction of order and love and sort of a kind of resolution. And it affects everybody because everybody is involved in the field. And so many times when I'm working, people will say I'm doing a weekend. People will come back the next day and say, "You're not going to believe this, but..." And I mean, so many examples of this, but one I remember was a woman who'd come to stay with her mother. I was working face to face at that point. It was before COVID, and they had come into London, where I live. I live in London, England, and staying with their mother. And their mother had been had no relationship, completely disconnected from her 6 brothers and sisters, completely estranged. On the second day, she came back. You're not going to believe this, but while we were working, at exactly the time we were working, all my mother's brothers and sisters, all of them, called her on the phone. So this is what happens. It's absolutely extraordinary, So people find long lost siblings they didn't know they had, or it's a kind of collection of the forgotten. It's very important, this remembering that which has been forgotten.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That is so powerful because, as you said, we're taught, oh, they've done this to me, they've harmed us, they need to be kicked out, they need to be released, we need to just cut them off. And yet they're still part of our field. And so we can only be joyful and whole if we also bring them in. And so I love how you shared that. Is there anything else on your heart that you would like to share with us today around ancestral healing and sound
Oh.
healing? Yeah.
Well, I mean, and I mean, the other thing is that what's so interesting, I've always worked a lot with scientists, you know, right from the very beginning, because I was, you know, working with a spiral, which is a pattern in nature, and working with resonance and patterns in flow and so forth. And then, of course, I married a scientist. And from that point of view, Rupert Sheldrake, I no longer felt the need to kind of do work with scientists because I was married to one. So I got on. But one of the things that's so interesting about this, because I always find that science sort of catches up. You know, I tend to see things, you know, in some mysterious way, and then I find science is catching up. I did a research fellowship with one of the three men who got the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA, for example, in the early 70s. Gosh, it makes me seem a long time ago. Anyway, and which of course is a kind of helix, and but not a spiral. And but one of the interesting thing about this work is that the hottest subject. Well, actually, it's interesting because in relation to DNA at that time, people thought everything was in the DNA. This was, you know, it was just assumed, finally, we've cracked it all, everything's in the DNA. And whereas before, you know, Lamarck and Lysenko and Darwin and all these people talked about the inheritance of acquired characters. So things that you acquire during your lifetime can be inherited. And now this is now called epigenetics, and it's the hottest subject in science. And they've now discovered that in nematode worms, that which is acquired during their lifetime goes on for at least 50 generations. And one of the most interesting experiments was done about 10 years ago in Atlanta, Georgia, about the inheritance of fear in mice. And this is particularly interesting because what they did was they subjected mice to a very interesting smell, acetone phenone. It smelled like flowers, like almonds or something, and then gave them an electric shock at the same time. They then bred these mice in vitro, deliberately in vitro, so that they wouldn't meet the children mice or the grandchildren mice or the great-grandchildren mice. But what they discovered was that the children mice were terrified of the smell, the same smell. So, and the grandchildren mice the same. So this inheritance, the fear that was acquired by the original generation was inherited at least by 2 generations. So this work, there's a tremendous amount of work now about the inheritance of from traumas, you know, from the Holocaust or the Irish famine or the famine in Sweden at the end of the 19th century, or the winter famine, the winter hunger, as it's called in Holland during the war. So there are all these racial traumas where they found that subsequent generations are not only have mental instabilities very often, but also have chemical changes. And so there's a lot of work now that being done, which really just emphasizes the kind of, you know, the kind of things that I'm working with, this inheritance of the traumas, and the wonderful thing about it is that we are the ones that can deal with it, and so we have, you know, this is the real silver lining. You know, we are the ones who are living, who can actually totally transform it, and it's a little bit like working with the Platonic forms. You know, we can change everything in the present, which changes the past and the future. And so when people say to me, "Oh, but they wouldn't say that," but they do. You know, it's absolutely amazing. They really, and they do, and they've said it. So even though they might, you know, this idea that that person wouldn't have said it, but you know, in the work, this person has said it, and so it's said, it's done. And so there are all kinds of, you know, all kinds of things that I've found. You know, if somebody in the past in a family has made good, for example, made a lot of money by some huge, you know, engineering feat, or the railways, or purveying of alcohol, or all the kind of things that people make their huge start dynasties with. What happens very often is that the descendants of the person who created the fortune will suffer in the way that the people who helped them make the fortune suffered. The people who were sacrificed in the making, the people who fell into the cement or into the molten metal, or who were drunk, or or the slaves or sort of. So the subsequent generations of these kind of families, really need to work with this, because they are the ones, of course, can change it, but they're the ones that also, suffer from as the people who help make the fortune. So there's all kinds of things that and patterns that go on through generations, which are absolutely fascinating.
Oh my God, I'm listening to you about I hadn't heard that part of the people who actually do good or make good through money, et cetera, success, that their families will then feel the effects of any abuse or anything that was incurred in attaining that wealth or attaining that success. And that
Absolutely.
is such a powerful, I think, invitation for us all to look more deeply within our stories, like you said, of any interruptions in our fields, and to work with someone like you and to work with you, because we all have those stories. When you said migrations, I'm like, most of my family lineage has migrated from here, from there, from the. I mean, my family's only been in this country 50 years. And then we were in another country only 80 years. So we've been migrating all over the place. So what are some traumas that we may not know about? Because you spoke to some that I didn't know of that you just shared about the success and then the family suffering. Is there something, maybe another story that may be in the back of your mind that may not be that typical, but it's something that folks also suffer from?
Oh my goodness. I mean, that's a kind of big story which happens when people create dynasties, but it happens, everybody, there are these kind of transgressive stories in so many families, of all kinds. And as you say, I mean, especially in countries like North America, where people have come very recently from somewhere else. I mean, I I was working before the pandemic. I was working in America, East Coast, West Coast, Canada, the West Coast, and what was so interesting about working regularly in the West Coast of Canada was that's so recent, and so I was working with people's migration stories. How they got there so often through some kind of dislocation with their. Usually people emigrate to make good. To make good for their children. People want to improve their lives. And so, whereas in East Coast of North America, the migration was a bit further away, further back in time, and of course in Europe it's even further back, because we've all migrated from somewhere at some point. But these migration stories are very interesting, and it's very important to honor the countries that you've been in. So if you come from a particular country, it's very important to honor that. Actually, thinking of South America, there are two very interesting films, Disney films. I don't normally like Disney cartoons. It's not something I follow. But there are two films which are very remarkable that have recently come out. One's Coco and one's Encanto. And Coco talks about the whole Mexican Day of the Dead, and how having photographs of the ancestors on the altar at certain points, and the importance of that, and the whole importance of the ancestors in that film. And then Encanto, another one which recently hit became famous, is very important, because it's all about this forgotten uncle, and the family, this great successful family sort of falls on hard times until they remember this hidden uncle, and then he's brought back into the fold, and then everything changes. So it's very interesting that these two films sort of incorporate these issues in this way. These very popular films, and so. And what's very interesting about doing this work is that when people are chosen to represent, these naive representatives, they don't know the person, they're chosen to represent people. And sometimes I have people representing people I actually know, and sometimes it's hilarious, they become these people. And so one time my son, I have two sons, and Cosmo, my musician son, I had these two brothers who worked with me a lot, and one of them was very successful. He was doing a PhD at Cambridge in music. His brother was less successful and was the vulnerable one, and they were both in the workshop. And the successful one chose my son to represent his vulnerable brother, who was watching all this. And my son, who's very, very cheerful and sort of light, and he was standing there, and he suddenly crumpled. And then I could see his working, because he's my son. This is ridiculous, I'm Cosmo. And he sort of came back to himself, and then crumpled again. And this is ridiculous, I'm Cosmo, and came back. And he went between himself, his cheerful self, when his rational mind kicked in, and then found himself sort of being pulled into this other person. And finally he gave up and became the other person. So when people are chosen to represent these other people, they become them. And so we're really working with the people through time and space, and in a way which is utterly miraculous, and leads to these extraordinary revelations. It's really amazing.
I love it. I have actually had experience being the people and also working on my own family constellations and issues. So incredibly powerful work. And thank you for being with us today. It's been really an honor to listen to your experience, your stories. And I love that you share how you were working with the scientists, from the 70s, and how, as you said, science seems to catch up to the mysterious and to the healing fields. Thank you all so much. So thank you so much, Jill, for being with us today. It's been an honor. And this has been a great session. Thank you all for listening and for being with us today. Thanks, Jill.
Thank you. Thank you.